Joining us now is Leah Littman, University of Michigan law professor and co-host of the podcast Strict Scrutiny, and Mark Joseph Stern, senior writer for Slate and the co-host of the Amicus podcast. Mark, fill in the gaps here. Why is the same-sex marriage issue back before the Supreme Court today?
Well, the court will be considering a petition by Kim Davis. You may remember she was the Kentucky clerk who refused to grant a marriage license to a same-sex couple shortly after the Supreme Court issued its decision. The couple she discriminated against sued and ultimately won $100,000 in damages. She is appealing that damages award and that decision and argues that she should have been able to raise a First Amendment defense that providing the license violated her freedom of religion. So what she's primarily asking for is to be free of a $100,000 judgment against her. But her lawyers added to the petition saying, while we're at it, we think this would be a great opportunity for the Supreme Court to re-examine and overturn the marriage equality ruling because it was wrong on the day it was decided and it has had bad consequences for anti-gay religious individuals like Davis.
Leah, if the justices decide to take up this case, what does that tell you?
If they decide to take it up, I think it's clear they would actually overrule Obergefell versus Hodges. There's no real reason for them to take it other than that, but I still don't think that's likely to happen. As Mark's summary made clear, this case involves a bunch of other questions aside from the future of marriage equality. And indeed, a few years ago, Kim Davis had asked the Supreme Court to take up this very same case at an earlier stage in the litigation, and the justices didn't do so. In fact, even Justices Alito and Thomas wrote to say they didn't even vote to hear this particular case to decide the future of marriage equality, even though they wanted to revisit that issue potentially in the future in another case.
Right. We know Justices Alito and Thomas have been vocal in their opposition to the Obergefell decision. Thomas even wrote in a concurrence to the decision overturning a right to an abortion that the court should, quote, reconsider all of this court's substantive due process precedents, including Griswold versus Connecticut, that's a contraception case, Lawrence v. Texas, a same-sex sexual relations issue, and Obergefell, this same-sex marriage case. Mark, it is a 6-3 conservative-leaning court. Do we know where the other conservative justices stand?
So, look, they haven't made it entirely clear the way that Thomas and Alito have. I think if marriage equality came to the court for the first time today, the court would rule 6-3 that there's no constitutional right for same-sex couples to marry. But this is now a precedent. It's been on the books for 10 years. As even Justice Amy Coney Barrett acknowledged in an interview recently, hundreds of thousands of couples now rely on this right. And that gives the court a good reason not to overturn it. My view is that justices like Barrett and John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh, they are trying to undermine LGBTQ equality in different ways that will trigger less backlash for the court. Rather than go after Obergefell, they are legalizing discrimination against gay people in goods and services. They are probably going to soon overturn bans on conversion therapy for LGBTQ minors. They are weaponizing the First Amendment against gay and trans equality, but they aren't going to go right at Obergefell, at least not yet, because they don't really want to spend down their political capital on something that would be so massively unpopular.
Let me play the comment that Mark just referenced from Justice Barrett related to Obergefell and same-sex marriage. Listen.
Well, to make it concrete, right? Yeah. So in Obergefell versus Hodges, right, the Supreme Court recognized a right to same-sex marriage. Originalist justices at the time believed that ruling was wrongly decided. One of the arguments for why Obergefell versus Hodges is unlikely to ever be overturned is the idea that people have made decisions about who to marry and therefore where to live and children and everything else on the basis of that ruling.
Yes, those are absolutely reliance interests, but I wouldn't describe them. When you said social reliance interests, that kind of sounds like in things in the air. Those are very concrete reliance interests. So those would be classic reliance interests in the terms of the law, in terms of legal doctrine. Those would be like, those are financial. Those are, medical. Those are, you can imagine going on.
So, Leah, when she talks about reliance interests, explain, what is that exactly? And do you think her answer means she's firmly against overturning Obergefell?
So reliance interests are part of the equation into stare decisis, the legal doctrine that tells the Supreme Court you shouldn't just overrule prior cases when you think they are wrong. And in particular, if there are reliance interests on those previous decisions, then the Supreme Court is counseled against overruling that previous decision. I found it interesting that Justice Barrett sought to distinguish the reliance interests on Obergefell from what she described as societal interests, because it was the societal interests that led the court to say there actually were no reliance interests on Roe versus Wade, because the only kind of reliance interest there was society's reliance on the idea that women could control when and whether they actually had children. And so by distinguishing the kind of reliance interests that she indicated were insufficient as to, keeping Roe versus Wade and suggesting there are different kinds of reliance interests on Obergefell versus Hodges, I think that is consistent with what Mark said earlier, namely several of the Republican appointees don't seem interested in outright overruling Obergefell at this particular moment.
We will see if they decide to take up this new case. Leah Littman, Mark Joseph Stern, thank you both so much for the conversation.